G'day, I'm Patrick, welcome to the workshop. Today I'm going to be showing you how I cut out some little electrical ports in a giant desk so that people can access power boards and so forth for their devices while retaining the continuous grain of the desktop. And I'm going to be using a tiny little router bit. This giant thing is a desk. It's about 3.5 meters long and it's designed for 3 kids of this family who are buying this desk to sit at work together. Each seat location will also have a little cubby that you open up to plug your devices in. It'll have power in there. I want those little cubbies to be pretty seamless. I want the grain to be continuous on the lids of that little power compartment as it is through the rest of the piece. In order to do that, I need to cut very fine lines to remove that little cap. And I'm going to be doing that with a 2mm router bit. Now, the challenge is, this thing only lets me do a depth of cut of about 6mm. The piece is 20mm thick. I'm going to come in from both sides, which will leave about 8mm for those doing your maths at home, which I'm going to have to remove with the Japanese saw. This little bit has no bearing. So instead of running a bearing like you normally would, I am going to be using the router base itself as the guide, which means my template needs to be much larger. Specifically, it needs to be 44mm larger because that's the distance from the router bit to the edge of this base plate. So the hole I want to cut is this wide, but my template is this wide. And this is just going to slide around in here very carefully, and I'm going to cut this little piece out with essentially a 2mm clearance the whole way around. You have to be very careful with this. If you don't follow that template accurately, you'll cut into your work and you'll see it. There's really no way to fix it. These little tiny bits heat up very quickly. You cannot cut that full 6mm depth in one pass. You might be able to do 3mm and another 3mm, but I'm probably going to do it in 2mm passes. So I'll do 3 passes with the trim router in each of these cubbies, and the same thing from the back. It's very time consuming. I can't think of a way of doing this to get that fine of a clearance without using one of these tiny router bits. Even if they did make a longer one, you couldn't push it that deep because it would just snap. I have snapped these. It's very easy to snap them. You need to go slow. They don't eject the waste very well. So the sawdust stays in the trench, which you need to clear out with compressed air or some other method. Time consuming, fiddly, but a good result. So I've cut all of the holes on the other side, and I flipped this board over and I started cutting from the backside, and I snapped one of the router bits. You can just barely see the tip there. This has happened almost every time I've used these. I don't see it as any fault of the bit. It's 2mm thick, it's solid carbide. They're just tiny and you're putting a lot of force on them. I initially said I was going to cut 2mm passes. I ended up cutting 3mm passes, and this one snapped as I got to the end of a pass, so it wasn't even under force. I just think it had been used solidly for 15 or 20 minutes, probably accumulated too much heat, and it snapped. But these aren't terribly expensive, and I bought two. And whenever I'm using these for a job, I kind of treat them a little bit as consumables. It's unfortunate, but when you're using really, really delicate parts like this, it's just kind of the way it is. So I'm going to put the other one in, maybe take slightly shallower passes, and finish this job off. Nothing ever goes perfectly to plan, but I do have these things cut out. Now, a few things changed along the way. I wasn't really able to use the Japanese saw in the way that I thought I could, because it just didn't cut through the bit of remaining timber as effectively as I thought it would. So this little Japanese saw does have teeth on the tip, the point being you can essentially do some sort of plunge cutting, but it's not particularly effective. Those teeth don't clear waste very well, and I was trying to do ripping cuts with the grain, so it just kind of filled up that cut as I was cutting it. I ended up using the plunge saw, track saw, to cut those sidelines here and here. The track saw has a blade width of about 1.5 or 1.6, so it can do these kinds of cuts pretty effectively. I could have, in theory, done all of those long cuts with the plunge saw, with the track saw. However, doing the router template gave me really clean corners and everything on the top side and let me match that on the underside. Now, to cut out the short bits, which essentially are end grain here, what I actually ended up doing is using the same template, moving from a 2mm router bit to a slightly, a slightly larger one. It was 4mm thick, and I just enlarged the width of the end grain cuts, not all the way through to the top where I'll see it, but just on the underneath. This won't affect my hinge placement, it's not going to affect how this lid operates, and I'll be able to smooth that off, and it's going to be it was a great way to get me out of that tricky situation. So you'll notice that the cut width on the end pieces from underneath are wider, but from the top it all looks seamless. So now that these are removed, I've essentially got the area that was cut with the router template at the top, the area that was cut with the router template at the bottom, and the little bit which is raised in the middle, which was cut by the track saw. I'm going to remove that raised bit and smooth all of this off using a straight router bit with a bearing, a pattern following bit, and that is going to clean all of this up. I might need to do a little bit of chisel work in the corners, but then these will be done, and I just need to be able to fit hinges, which I've done a whole video on, and it's a real pain in the ass. But you can check out the video on fitting sauce hinges or hidden hinges for a piece like this. There'll be a link to that down below. Okay, so all three of my little compartments have been separated. They're cut, they're free, they are not hinged yet because that is a process that I'm working through. But I'll show you what they look like. You can see this 2mm clearance the whole way around and how that looks. So you can see with that center one there that the grain really continues through. That little sap line that's there, that little feature, it is in the lid and it is in the piece of the desk. And I think when I add oil to this, that'll be even more apparent. It just makes it seem so much more professional. A couple of thoughts. If you were going to do this, ideally, you would not do a piece of timber that was more than twice the possible cutting length of one of those tiny router bits. So those router bits will cut 6mm I actually can get them to cut about 7.5 if you're really careful. So ideally, you'd be working on 15 or 14 mil timber. Now that's not actually great for a desktop or anything really, it's kind of a bit too thin. My initial plan was to sort of hollow out the underside of these little compartments, but it just wasn't super practical. One other way that I've seen this done is if you were going to do square little compartments like this or rectangular compartments, that entire strip could be glued in separately. And that would allow you to kind of pre-cut them, put in a sacrificial spacer, and then glue the whole desktop together with those cross lines already cut. So in this case, it would be you'd already cut this line, and this entire strip would be one continuous piece of wood that was glued in separately. If you want to do anything that's curvy, anything that has rounded ends, that uses the same timber, you really are limited to using one of those little tiny router bits. There is also a 1.6 mil straight cut that's solid carbide. I've used that as well. It does the same thing. To use them effectively, do very shallow passes. They will break, they will overheat. You really can't push it much more than about 2 or 3 mil maximum depth. You need to clear the waste really effectively. The bit will not do it by itself. So you need to go to vacuum, clean that out before you do the next pass. You need a very solid template that's not going to slip around, because if it slips around, there's no hiding it. You're going to cut into your work. And buy a spare bit, because even with all of the best intentions, you probably will break one. But you can use these bits with a variety of rounded templates of any shape to cut through the timber. It's always a bit of a fiddle, but you can get good results, and I think the client's going to be really happy with this. Thanks a lot for coming and hanging out in my workshop, seeing what I'm up to. There's some links down below to the tiny router bits I've been using, as well as a link to the video on the SOS hinges, which is probably what I'm going to install on this as well. I hope you got something out of it. Come along, join me next week, click subscribe and you'll get notified about the videos each week that they come out. Thanks for coming. See you soon.